broken past mended. Lady Cecily of Ravensshire had spent years avoiding Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's most ruthless enforcer. But when he found her in the royal archives, his voice was quiet, edged with warning. "You should not be here, Cecily," he murmured. "And now, I fear it is too late to leave." Chapter 1. The Serpent in the Archive. Dust motes danced in the slanted rays of afternoon light, illuminating the towering shelves of the royal archives. The scent of aged parchment and beeswax hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort to Lady Cecily of Ravensshire. She ran a gloved hand along the spines of the ancient scrolls, her touch feather-light, as if caressing the very skin of history. Here, nestled deep within the heart of King Alaric's castle, she found a semblance of peace, a refuge from the ceaseless whirl of courtly life and the ever-present ache of memory. Cecily had sought this solitude for weeks, ever since her return to court after a year spent in the quietude of her family's northern estate. Ravensshire, with its mist-shrouded moors and ancient stone walls, had offered a balm to her wounded spirit, a place to mourn in private, away from the prying eyes and whispered judgments of the king's courtiers. But duty, that relentless shackle, had called her back. Her brother, Edmund, newly appointed to the king's council, had insisted on her presence. He needed her, he'd said, her sharp wit and even sharper eye for detail. But Cecily suspected the truth was far more complicated. Edmund, ever ambitious, saw her as a pawn in his intricate game of power. A beautiful, widowed lady of noble birth was a valuable asset, one he could use to forge alliances and curry favor with the king. The thought sent a shiver of unease down her spine. She had no desire to be bartered away again, to be bound to another man for political gain. Her first marriage, arranged when she was barely 16, had been a cold, loveless affair, ending only with her husband's death in a skirmish on the borderlands. Lost in her thoughts, Cecily reached for a particularly worn scroll, its leather binding cracked and faded. It was a chronicle of the early kings of Eldoria, a tale of battles won and lost, of betrayals and alliances forged in blood. She carefully unrolled the parchment, her fingers tracing the faded ink of the ancient scribe. The words blurred before her eyes, the stories of long-dead kings merging with the ghosts of her own past. A sudden sound, the scrape of a boot against the stone floor, shattered the silence. Cecily froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She had been so careful, so certain she was alone. The archives were rarely frequented, their secrets guarded by a stern-faced librarian and the king's own decree. Slowly, she turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the small dagger she kept hidden beneath her gown. Her eyes met his, and the breath caught in her chest. Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's enforcer, the Hound of Eldoria, they called him, a man known for his ruthlessness, his unwavering loyalty to the crown, and his chilling lack of mercy. He stood framed in the doorway, a figure of imposing strength and dark, brooding intensity. The afternoon light caught the hard planes of his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, held a glint of steel, assessing her with a cold, unnerving precision. He was dressed in his customary black, the leather of his jerkin and breeches molded to his powerful frame. A heavy sword hung at his hip, its hilt glinting ominously in the dim light. He was the embodiment of the king's power, a living weapon, and Cecily knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was not a man to be trifled with. Years she had managed to avoid him. Years of carefully orchestrated absences, of feigned illnesses and timely retreats. She had heard the whispers, the tales of his unwavering, some say cruel, dedication to King Alaric. He was the shadow that fell across every conspiracy, the blade that severed every threat. And she, with her secrets and her carefully guarded past, felt exposed and vulnerable beneath his gaze. His voice, when he spoke, was low and quiet, yet it carried an undercurrent of warning, a subtle threat that sent a shiver of apprehension through her. "You should not be here, Cecily," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering for a heartbeat too long on the delicate curve of her neck. And now, I fear it is too late to leave. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Cecily felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She had always known that her past, her carefully constructed facade of innocence, was a fragile thing. And now, standing before Sir Nicholas Warwick, she felt that facade crumbling, revealing the vulnerable woman beneath. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance she did not entirely feel. "I am merely seeking knowledge, Sir Nicholas," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Surely, that is not a crime." A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or something far darker crossed his face. "Knowledge can be a dangerous thing, Lady Cecily," he replied, his voice a silken whisper that seemed to wrap around her like a coil of smoke. "Especially when it is sought in forbidden places." He took a step closer, and Cecily instinctively recoiled, her back pressing against the cold stone of the bookshelf. The scent of him, leather and steel and something indefinably masculine, filled her senses, unsettling her composure. She could feel the heat of his body, the barely contained power that emanated from him, and it both terrified and intrigued her. "These archives are restricted," he continued, his gaze sweeping the shelves around them. "Only those with the king's express permission may enter." Cecily swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. I was not aware," she stammered, the lie sticking in her throat. She had been aware, of course. But the lure of the past, the need to understand the forces that had shaped her life, had been too strong to resist. Nicholas's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing, as if he could see through her lies, through the carefully constructed mask she wore for the world. "Ignorance is no excuse, Lady Cecily," he said softly. "Especially for one of your standing." The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. He knew something of her past, of the secrets she had so desperately tried to bury. The realization sent a wave of panic through her, threatening to overwhelm her carefully cultivated composure. She forced herself to take a deep breath, to regain control. "I assure you, Sir Nicholas," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength, "I meant no harm. I will leave at once." She made to move past him, but he blocked her path, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. The gesture was not overtly threatening, yet it was a clear indication of his power, of his ability to control her movements, her very freedom. "Not so fast, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a tremor through her. "The king has an interest in your presence here." Cecily's heart sank. This was worse than she had feared. The king's interest was never a good thing. It meant scrutiny, interrogation, perhaps even imprisonment. She had seen what happened to those who fell afoul of Alaric's capricious favor. "The king?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What interest could he possibly have in me?" A slow smile, devoid of any warmth, curved Nicholas's lips. "That, my lady, is for the king to reveal. And I," he added, his gaze locking with hers, "am to escort you to him." The words hung heavy, a prelude to the unknown. The serpent had entered her sanctuary, and now she found herself ensnared. Chapter 2. A Knight's Shadowed Gaze. The walk to the King's Solar was a silent procession of dread. Cecily walked a pace ahead of Sir Nicholas, acutely aware of his presence behind her, a constant, watchful shadow. The tapestries lining the corridors, usually vibrant with scenes of hunts and battles, seemed muted, their colors dulled by the weight of her apprehension. The familiar sounds of the castle, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children playing in the courtyard seemed to fade into a muffled background hum, leaving only the rhythmic thud of her own heart and the measured tread of Sir Nicholas's boots on the stone floor. She tried to compose herself, to gather the tattered remnants of her dignity. She was Lady Cecily of Ravensshire, a woman of noble birth and considerable influence. She would not cower before the king, nor before his intimidating enforcer. But beneath the surface of her composure, fear gnawed at her. She had secrets, carefully guarded secrets that could unravel her life, and she knew that Sir Nicholas Warwick was not a man to be easily deceived. He had not spoken a word since they left the archives, his silence more unnerving than any interrogation. She could feel his gaze on her, a constant pressure, assessing, judging. What did he see? Did he see the fear she tried so desperately to conceal? Did he see the guilt that clung to her like a shroud? She stole a sideways glance at him, trying to decipher the expression on his face. His features were impassive, carved from granite, revealing nothing of his thoughts. But his eyes held a depth of intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. They were not the cold, calculating eyes of a predator, as she had expected. There was a hint of something else there, a flicker of something she could not quite define. Sorrow, perhaps? Or something even more profound, a hidden burden that weighed heavily on his soul. It was a fleeting glimpse, a momentary crack in the armor of his stoicism, but it was enough to unsettle her. She had always believed him to be a man without heart, a creature of pure, unyielding force. But now, she wondered if there was more to Sir Nicholas Warwick than met the eye. Perhaps, beneath the surface of his ruthlessness, there lay a man capable of feeling, of suffering. The thought was both intriguing and terrifying. She had no desire to delve into the complexities of his character, to unravel the mysteries of his past. She had enough troubles of her own. Yet, she could not deny the strange pull she felt towards him, a mixture of fear and fascination that both repelled and attracted her. They reached the King's Solar, a large, opulent chamber filled with the trappings of power. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the richly carved furniture, the gleaming tapestries, and the massive oak table that dominated the center of the room. King Alaric sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled before him, his gaze fixed on Cecily as she entered. He was a man in his late 50s, his face lined with the burdens of rule, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He wore a robe of deep crimson, embroidered with gold thread, and a heavy gold chain of office hung around his neck. He exuded an aura of power and authority, a presence that demanded respect and obedience. Cecily curtsied low, her head bowed in deference. "Your Majesty," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. Alaric gestured for her to rise. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You have been keeping secrets." The words, though softly spoken, struck her like a blow. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her pale and shaken. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it for years, but she was still unprepared for the cold, hard reality of it. I do not know what you mean, Your Majesty," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Alaric's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "Do not play the innocent with me, Cecily," he said, his voice hardening. "Sir Nicholas found you in the restricted archives. You were searching for something you did not want me to find." Cecily's mind raced. She could deny it, of course, but she knew it would be futile. Sir Nicholas would have already reported everything he had seen, every detail of her behavior. She was trapped, caught in a web of her own making. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the inevitable. "I was looking for information about my family," she said, choosing her words carefully. "About Ravensshire." It was a partial truth, a carefully constructed lie designed to deflect the king's suspicion. She had been looking for information about Ravensshire, but not in the way he imagined. She had been searching for evidence of a past betrayal, a secret that could destroy her family's reputation and bring ruin upon them all. Alaric seemed to consider her words for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Ravensshire," he repeated, his voice laced with a hint of skepticism. "A noble house, with a long and complicated history." He paused, his eyes flicking to Sir Nicholas, who stood silently by the door, his expression unreadable. "Sir Nicholas," Alaric said, turning his attention back to Cecily, "has informed me of your reluctance to speak of your late husband." Cecily felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Her husband. The very mention of his name sent a wave of pain and guilt washing over her. She had loved him, in her own way, but their marriage had been a sham, a carefully constructed facade designed to conceal a terrible truth. My husband is dead, Your Majesty, she said, her voice flat and emotionless. There is nothing more to say. On the contrary, Lady Cecily, Alaric replied, his voice sharp and insistent.
There is much more to say.
Much more than you have been willing to reveal. He leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers. I have received reports, he said, his voice low and dangerous, of certain irregularities surrounding your husband's death. Irregularities that suggest treason. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Treason, the ultimate crime, punishable by death. Cecily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had known this day might come, had lived in fear of it for years, but she had never truly believed it would happen. She looked at Sir Nicholas, her eyes pleading for understanding, for mercy. But his face remained impassive, his gaze fixed on the king, his loyalty unwavering. He was the king's instrument, his weapon, and she was his target. The king's gaze held hers, a silent challenge. The weight of the crown, the weight of her secrets, pressed down upon her. The knight's shadowed gaze, however, lingered on her face, a flicker of something passing across his features before he masked it once more. Chapter 3. The King's Decree. Cecily's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis.
Treason.
The accusation, so casually uttered by the king, echoed in the opulent solar, bouncing off the tapestries and the polished wood, each repetition a hammer blow to her composure. She felt lightheaded, the richly patterned carpet beneath her feet seeming to sway. Your Majesty, she began, her voice a fragile thread, I assure you, there is no truth to these reports. My husband was a loyal servant of the crown. He died fighting for Eldoria. It was a lie, a carefully crafted fabrication she had maintained for years. Her husband, Lord Alaric of Hawthorne, a cruel irony, sharing the king's name, had indeed died in battle, but not as a hero. He had been plotting with Eldoria's enemies, a conspiracy Cecily had discovered only days before his death. She had confronted him, pleaded with him to abandon his treacherous plans, but he had refused, blinded by ambition and greed. His death had been a convenient escape, a way to silence him before his treachery could be exposed. Cecily had kept a secret, burying it deep within her heart, along with her grief and her guilt. She had told herself it was for the best, that it was better for him to be remembered as a hero than a traitor. But the truth had haunted her, a constant reminder of her own complicity. King Alaric studied her, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. He was a shrewd man, not easily fooled. He had ruled Eldoria for decades, navigating the treacherous currents of courtly politics with a cunning that bordered on ruthlessness. He had seen through countless lies, uncovered countless conspiracies. Cecily knew that she was no match for his experience, his power. Loyalty is a virtue easily claimed, Lady Cecily, he said, his voice laced with a hint of skepticism. But it is far more difficult to prove. He gestured to a scroll lying on the table before him. This report, he said, tapping the parchment with a long, slender finger, contains evidence of your husband's correspondence with Lord Valerius of Northwood. Valerius, as you know, is a sworn enemy of Eldoria. Cecily's heart sank. Valerius. She had known him, had danced with him at court before her marriage, before his open rebellion against the king. He was a charming, charismatic man, with a dangerous allure that had captivated many. She had been warned to stay away from him, but she had foolishly disregarded the warnings, drawn to his rebellious spirit, his defiance of authority. I cannot explain this, she stammered, her voice trembling. Perhaps it is a forgery. It was a weak defense, and she knew it. The king's scribes were meticulous, their records impeccable. Forgery was unlikely, and Alaric would not be swayed by such a flimsy excuse. He sighed, a sound of weary resignation. Lady Cecily, he said, his voice softening slightly, I do not wish to believe you are guilty of treason. You are a woman of noble birth, a member of a respected family. Your brother, Edmund, serves me faithfully on my council. He paused, his gaze shifting to Sir Nicholas, who remained standing silently by the door, a watchful presence. But I cannot ignore this evidence, Alaric continued. I have a duty to protect my kingdom, to root out all threats to its stability. He leaned forward, his gaze locking with Cecily's. Therefore, he said, his voice firm and resolute, I have decided to place you under the protection of Sir Nicholas Warwick. Cecily's breath caught in her throat. Protection? It was a euphemism, a thinly veiled threat. She was to be his prisoner, his charge, subject to his constant scrutiny, his unwavering control. He will ensure your safety, Alaric continued, and he will investigate these allegations against your late husband. Investigate. The word sent a shiver of fear down her spine. She knew what that meant. Sir Nicholas would delve into her past, uncover her secrets, expose her lies. He would leave no stone unturned, no shadow unexplored. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would find the truth. Your Majesty, she began, her voice pleading, I beg you, reconsider. I am innocent. I pose no threat to you, or your kingdom. Alaric shook his head. My decision is made, Lady Cecily, he said, his voice final. You will remain under Sir Nicholas's care until this matter is resolved. He will be responsible for your well-being and for ensuring that you do not flee.
Flee.
The word hung in the air, a stark reminder of her vulnerability. She had nowhere to run, no one to turn to. She was trapped, caught in a web of the king's making, with Sir Nicholas Warwick as her jailer. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of compassion, some hint of understanding. But his expression remained impassive, his gaze fixed on the king, his loyalty absolute. He was the Hound of Eldoria, the king's enforcer, and she was his prey. Sir Nicholas, Alaric said, turning to his knight, you will escort Lady Cecily to your quarters. You will ensure that she is comfortable and that she has everything she needs. But you will also ensure that she does not leave the castle without my express permission. Nicholas bowed his head. As you command, Your Majesty, he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned to Cecily, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, judging. She felt a tremor of fear run through her, but she forced herself to meet his eyes, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. She would not cower before him. She would not let him see her fear. Come, Lady Cecily, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It is time to leave. He offered her his arm, a gesture of courtesy that seemed strangely out of place, given the circumstances. Cecily hesitated for a moment, then, with a deep breath, she placed her hand on his arm. His touch was surprisingly gentle, but she could feel the strength beneath, the power that he held in check. As they walked out of the solar, leaving the king behind, Cecily felt a sense of despair wash over her. She was a prisoner in her own castle, her fate in the hands of a man she barely knew, a man who held her life, her future, in his grasp. The decree had been made. Her only path now led directly through the shadowed gaze of the king's most feared knight. Chapter 4. Echoes of Ravensheim. Nicholas's quarters were, predictably, Spartan. Unlike the opulent chambers of the royal family and high-ranking nobles, his rooms reflected his singular focus: duty. A large, functional bed dominated the main chamber, its hangings a plain, dark blue, devoid of any embroidery or ornamentation. A sturdy oak table and 2 chairs sat near the hearth, where a small fire crackled, providing the only source of warmth and light besides a single, narrow window. A weapon rack stood against one wall, displaying an array of swords, axes, and daggers, each meticulously cleaned and sharpened. The only personal touch was a small, intricately carved wooden box that sat on the mantelpiece, its lid closed, its contents a mystery. Cecily stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, feeling a strange mixture of apprehension and curiosity. This was the private domain of the king's enforcer, a space rarely seen by outsiders, a reflection of the man himself. It was stark, unyielding, yet strangely compelling. Nicholas closed the door behind them, the heavy oak echoing in the silence. He did not lock it, a subtle indication that he did not consider her a flight risk, or perhaps that he was confident in his ability to prevent her escape. He turned to her, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her disheveled appearance, the lingering traces of fear in her eyes. "You will be comfortable here, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice surprisingly neutral, devoid of the threat she had expected. "I have instructed my servants to bring you food and water, and anything else you may require." Cecily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was grateful for his courtesy, yet she could not shake the feeling that she was a prisoner, a bird trapped in a gilded cage. He gestured towards the table.
"Please sit," he said.
"We need to discuss your situation." Cecily hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked to the table and sat down, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Nicholas remained standing, towering over her, his presence filling the room. "The king has entrusted me with your care," he began, his voice low and serious. "And with investigating the allegations against your late husband." Cecily flinched at the mention of her husband's name, the old wound reopening, raw and painful. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I understand your distress," Nicholas continued, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But I must ask you some questions. I need to understand the truth of what happened." Cecily took a deep breath, steeling herself for the ordeal. She knew she could not avoid his questions, that she would have to reveal at least some of her secrets. But she would be careful, she would choose her words wisely, she would protect herself as best she could. "Ask what you will, Sir Nicholas," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "I will answer truthfully, to the best of my ability." He nodded, a flicker of respect, perhaps, crossing his face. "Tell me about your marriage," he said. "About your relationship with Lord Alaric of Hawthorne." Cecily closed her eyes for a moment, summoning the memories she had tried so hard to suppress. She remembered the day she had met her husband, a handsome, charming nobleman, 10 years her senior. He had seemed kind, attentive, everything she had ever desired in a husband. But the reality had been far different. "It was an arranged marriage," she began, her voice halting. "My father believed it was a good match, a way to strengthen our family's position." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We were not close," she continued. "He was often away, attending to his duties, fighting for the king." It was a partial truth, a carefully constructed lie designed to conceal the reality of her husband's infidelity, his cruelty, his ultimate betrayal. Nicholas watched her closely, his gaze unwavering. "Did you love him?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft. The question caught her off guard. Love? It was a word she had not dared to speak, a feeling she had not allowed herself to experience, not after the pain of her first marriage. "I respected him," she said, avoiding the direct question. "He was my husband. I owed him my loyalty." Loyalty. It was a hollow word, a mask she had worn to conceal her true feelings. She had been loyal to him, in her own way, by keeping his secret, by protecting his reputation even after his death. But it had come at a great cost, a cost she was still paying. Nicholas seemed to sense her hesitation, her reluctance to reveal the truth. He moved closer, his presence filling her senses. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice a low murmur, "I understand that this is difficult for you. But I need your cooperation. I need you to trust me."
Trust.
It was a dangerous word, a concept she had long abandoned. How could she trust him, the king's enforcer, the man who held her fate in his hands? She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the strength there, the unwavering determination, but she also saw something else, a flicker of compassion, a hint of understanding. It was a fleeting glimpse, a momentary crack in his armor, but it was enough to give her a glimmer of hope. "Ravensshire," she whispered, the name of her home a sudden, unexpected plea. "It means everything to me." It was a truth she hadn't planned to reveal, a vulnerability she hadn't intended to show. But the word, spoken aloud, brought with it a flood of memories, the scent of heather on the wind, the sound of the river rushing through the valley, the warmth of the fire in the great hall. Ravensshire was her sanctuary, her refuge, the only place she had ever truly felt safe. Nicholas's gaze softened, his expression shifting, as if her words had struck a chord within him. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers for a moment, before he drew back, as if realizing the impropriety of the gesture. But the near touch, the unspoken connection, lingered in the air between them. The echoes of her home, it seemed, had resonated within the stoic night. Chapter 5. The Weight of a Lost Love. The silence that followed Cecily's whispered plea hung heavy in the room, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire. Nicholas stood there, his gaze fixed on her, his expression unreadable. The near touch, the unspoken connection, had created a strange tension between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their circumstances. He moved away from the table, walking towards the narrow window, his back to her. He stood there for a long moment, gazing out at the darkening sky, his shoulders slumped, as if burdened by a weight she could not see. Raven's Hire, he repeated, his voice low and thoughtful, almost to himself. A wild and beautiful place. I have seen it once, many years ago. Cecily was surprised. She had not expected him to have any knowledge of her home, let alone a personal connection to it. It was a remote place, far from the center of power, rarely visited by outsiders. You have been to Raven's Hire? She asked, her voice hesitant. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the distant horizon. I was a young knight then, he said, his voice tinged with a hint of nostalgia. Newly sworn to the king's service. I was sent north on a mission. He paused, as if reluctant to continue, as if the memories were painful. Cecily sensed a story there, a hidden chapter in his past that he had kept locked away, just as she had kept her own secrets hidden. What kind of mission? She asked, her curiosity piqued. He turned back to her, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes, usually so cold and guarded, held a flicker of something else, a hint of vulnerability, of pain. It was a search, he said, his voice halting. For a woman. A woman. The word sent a strange shiver through Cecily. She had expected him to speak of battles, of conspiracies, of the usual duties of a king's knight. But a woman, it was unexpected, intriguing.
Who is she?
Cecily asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, as if struggling with the decision to reveal the truth. Then, with a sigh, he spoke. Her name was Alara, he said, the name a soft, almost reverent whisper. She was the woman I loved. The revelation stunned Cecily. Sir Nicholas Warwick, the ruthless enforcer, the Hound of Eldoria, had loved? It seemed impossible, incongruous with the image she had formed of him. Yet, the pain in his eyes, the tremor in his voice, were undeniable. What would happen to her? Cecily asked, her voice filled with a genuine empathy she had not expected to feel. He turned away again, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. She was accused of treason, he said, his voice heavy with grief. She was said to be a spy, working for our enemies. Treason. The same accusation that hung over Cecily's head, the same threat that had shattered her world. She felt a sudden kinship with this man, this hardened knight who had known the same pain, the same fear that she was now experiencing. Did you believe it? Cecily asked, her voice barely audible.
He shook his head.
No, he said, his voice firm and resolute. I knew her. I knew her heart. She was innocent. He paused, his fists clenching at his sides. But I could not save her, he continued, his voice raw with anguish. I was too young, too inexperienced. I did not have the power, the influence, to challenge the king's decree. He turned back to Cecily, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. She was executed, he said, the word a choked whisper. And I have carried that burden ever since. The weight of his lost love, the guilt and the grief, filled the room, a palpable presence. Cecily felt tears welling up in her eyes, tears not just for her own troubles, but for the pain of this man, this knight who had loved and lost, just as she had. She reached out, her hand instinctively reaching for his, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. This time, he did not pull away. He allowed her to touch him, his fingers closing around hers, a fragile connection between two wounded souls. I am sorry, Sir Nicholas, she said, her voice trembling. I understand more than you know. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if seeking solace, as if hoping to find a glimmer of hope in the darkness of his past. The unspoken question hung between them. Could they find healing in each other's shared pain? Could they find a way to overcome the burdens of their pasts, the accusations that threatened to destroy them both? The weight was immense, but for the first time, Cecily felt a sliver of something besides despair, a fragile, tentative connection to the man who was both her captor and, perhaps, her only hope. Chapter 6. Whispers in the Great Hall. The next morning, Cecily awoke to the sound of a gentle knocking on the door. She had slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by images of her late husband, of Sir Nicholas, and of the king's accusing gaze. She felt a sense of unease, a premonition that the day would bring new challenges, new dangers. A young serving woman entered, carrying a tray laden with food, a bowl of porridge, a loaf of bread, a small jug of ale. She curtsied to Cecily, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sir Nicholas sends his greetings, my lady, she said, her voice trembling slightly.
He says you are to eat and rest.
He will see you later. Cecily nodded, her appetite gone. She thanked the woman, who quickly left the room, closing the door behind her. Cecily sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the food, her mind racing. She knew she could not remain confined to Nicholas's quarters forever. She needed to gather information, to understand the nature of the accusations against her, to find a way to clear her name. She needed to speak to her brother, Edmund, to see if he could offer any assistance, any insight into the king's motives. But she was a prisoner, under the constant watch of Sir Nicholas. She could not simply walk out of the castle, could not risk being seen by the wrong people. She needed a plan, a way to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life without drawing undue attention to herself. She ate a small portion of the porridge, forcing herself to swallow, knowing she needed to keep up her strength. She dressed in a simple gown of dark blue, choosing a color that would help her blend into the shadows, a color that would not attract unwanted attention. She braided her hair, securing it tightly at the nape of her neck, a practical style that would not hinder her movements. She paced the room, her mind working furiously. She needed an opportunity, a moment of distraction, a chance to slip away unnoticed. She needed to find a way to reach her brother, to speak to him in private, without Sir Nicholas's knowledge. An idea began to form in her mind, a risky plan that could either save her or condemn her. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but she had no other choice. She was fighting for her life, for her freedom, for the future of Ravensshire. Later that afternoon, Sir Nicholas returned. He had been attending to his duties, meeting with the king, overseeing the training of his knights. He looked tired, his face etched with lines of fatigue, but his gaze was as sharp and alert as ever. Have you rested, Lady Cecily? He asked, his voice neutral. Yes, thank you, Sir Nicholas, she replied, her voice calm and composed. She had rehearsed her words, her demeanor, preparing herself for this encounter. I have been thinking, she continued, her gaze meeting his, about my situation, about the allegations against my late husband. He nodded, his expression unreadable. And? I realize that I may have been less than forthcoming, she said, choosing her words carefully. There are things that I have not told you. Things that may be relevant to your investigation. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of interest crossing his face.
Go on, he said.
But I am reluctant to speak of them here, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. In these confined quarters, I fear being overheard. It was a calculated risk, a subtle manipulation designed to appeal to his sense of caution, his awareness of the ever-present dangers of courtly life. He seemed to consider her words for a moment, his gaze searching hers. Where do you suggest we speak?
He asked.
The Great Hall, she replied, her voice steady. During the evening meal, there will be many people present, many conversations. Our words will be lost in the crowd. It was a bold suggestion, a dangerous gamble. The Great Hall was the heart of the castle, a place of constant activity, of whispered conversations and clandestine meetings. It was also a place where she could be easily observed, where her every move could be scrutinized. But it was also the only place where she could hope to speak to her brother without arousing suspicion. The evening meal was a chaotic affair, with hundreds of people gathered together, eating, drinking, and talking. It was the perfect cover for a secret conversation, a chance to exchange information without being overheard. Nicholas hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks. He knew that the Great Hall was a dangerous place, a breeding ground for intrigue and conspiracy. But he also knew that Cecily was right. Their conversation would be less conspicuous there than in the isolation of his quarters. "Very well," he said, his voice grudging. "We will speak in the Great Hall. But I will be watching you, Lady Cecily. Do not attempt anything foolish." Cecily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had won a small victory, a temporary reprieve. But she knew that the real challenge lay ahead. She had to reach her brother, she had to uncover the truth, and she had to do it all under the watchful gaze of Sir Nicholas Warwick, the man who held her fate in his hands. The whispers of the Great Hall, she hoped, would conceal more than they revealed. Chapter 7. A Dance of Deception. The Great Hall was a cacophony of sound and movement. The long tables were laden with food-roasted meats, steaming stews, freshly baked bread, and the air was thick with the aroma of spices and ale. Hundreds of people were gathered, their voices rising and falling in a constant hum of conversation. Knights in shining armor mingled with ladies in elegant gowns, merchants and craftsmen jostled with servants and squires. It was a microcosm of Eldorian society, a vibrant tapestry of life and intrigue. Cecily walked beside Sir Nicholas, her head held high, her expression carefully composed. She wore a gown of deep green, a color that complemented her auburn hair and hazel eyes, a color that made her stand out without being overly ostentatious. She had chosen her attire carefully, wanting to project an image of confidence and composure, despite the turmoil she felt within. Nicholas, as always, was dressed in black, his imposing figure drawing glances from many of those present. He walked with a quiet authority, his gaze constantly scanning the crowd, alert for any sign of trouble, any threat to his charge. They were seated at a table near the center of the hall, a position that offered a good view of the entire room, but also made them visible to everyone present. Cecily felt exposed, vulnerable, like a butterfly pinned beneath a collector's gaze. She searched the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces, looking for her brother, Edmund. She spotted him across the hall, seated at a table with several other members of the King's Council. He was deep in conversation with Lord Grayson, a powerful and influential nobleman, a man known for his ambition and his ruthlessness. Cecily felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She needed to speak to Edmund, but she could not simply approach him, not with Sir Nicholas watching her every move. She needed a distraction, a way to create an opportunity for a private conversation. She turned to Nicholas, forcing a smile to her lips. "The food looks delicious," she said, her voice light and casual. "I am quite famished." It was a lie, of course. She had no appetite, her stomach churning with nerves. But she needed to engage him in conversation, to distract him, to make him believe she was relaxed and unconcerned. Nicholas nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "Eat," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You need to keep up your strength." Cecily picked at the food on her plate, pretending to eat, her mind racing. She needed to find a way to signal Edmund, to let him know she needed to speak to him urgently. She caught his eye across the hall, holding his gaze for a moment, trying to convey a message of urgency, of desperation. He seemed to notice her, his expression shifting slightly, a flicker of concern crossing his face. She subtly gestured towards a small alcove near the back of the hall, a secluded spot where they could speak in private. It was a risky move, but she had no other choice. Edmund nodded almost imperceptibly, acknowledging her message. He excused himself from his conversation with Lord Grayson, saying he needed a breath of fresh air. Cecily waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as Edmund made his way through the crowd, his movements casual, unhurried. He approached the alcove, glancing around to make sure they were not being observed. Cecily turned to Nicholas, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir Nicholas," she said, I feel a bit faint. I need a moment of privacy." She gestured towards the alcove, her eyes pleading. "Would you allow me a few moments alone?" It was a gamble, a test of his trust, or perhaps of his compassion. She knew he was suspicious of her, that he was constantly watching for any sign of deception. But she also knew that he was not entirely immune to her pleas, that he had shown her a flicker of kindness, of understanding. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers, as if trying to read her thoughts, to decipher her motives. Then, with a sigh, he nodded. "Very well, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice grudging. "But I will be watching you. Do not try anything foolish." Cecily breathed a sigh of relief. She had done it. She had created an opportunity. Now, she had to make the most of it. She quickly walked to the alcove, her heart pounding in her chest. Edmund was waiting for her, his face etched with concern. "Cecily," he whispered, his voice urgent. "What is happening? Why are you with Warwick?" "It's a long story, Edmund," she replied, her voice equally urgent. "But the king, he suspects me of treason. He believes my late husband was involved with Valerius." Edmund's eyes widened in alarm. "Treason?" he exclaimed. That's madness. You must deny it, Cecily. You must convince the king of your innocence." "I've tried, Edmund," she said, her voice desperate. "But he has evidence. Correspondence between my husband and Valerius." "Damn him," Edmund muttered, his fists clenching. "Alaric was always a fool, blinded by ambition." "Edmund, you have to help me," Cecily pleaded. "You have influence with the king. You can speak to him, convince him of my innocence." Edmund hesitated, his face troubled. "I will try, Cecily," he said, his voice uncertain. "But it's a dangerous game. The king is unpredictable. And Warwick, he's not a man to be trifled with." He looked around nervously. "We must be careful," he whispered. "We cannot be seen together. It would arouse suspicion." He took a step back, his gaze darting around the hall. "I will do what I can, Cecily," he said, his voice barely audible. "But you must be careful. Trust no one, especially not Warwick." And with that, he slipped back into the crowd, leaving Cecily alone in the alcove, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and dread. The dance had begun, and she was caught in its treacherous rhythm, unsure of her next step, unsure of who to trust. She knew, however, she wasn't alone. Warwick's gaze was still firmly on her. Chapter 8. The Falcon and the Dove. Cecily returned to the table, her heart still pounding from her brief, clandestine meeting with Edmund. Nicholas watched her approach, his expression unreadable, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He had allowed her a moment of privacy, but he had not taken his eyes off her. Not for a single second. "Are you feeling better, Lady Cecily?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of skepticism. "Yes, thank you, Sir Nicholas," she replied, forcing a smile to her lips. "Just a momentary dizziness. The heat, I suppose." It was a weak excuse, but she hoped it would suffice. She needed to regain his trust, or, at least, to allay his suspicions. She needed him to believe that she was not a threat, that she was not plotting against him, against the king. She sat down, avoiding his gaze, pretending to be interested in the food on her plate. She picked at a piece of roasted chicken, forcing herself to swallow, her mind racing. Edmund's words echoed in her mind. Trust no one, especially not Warwick. But was that true? Could she really trust no one? Was Nicholas truly her enemy, or was there a possibility, however slim, that he could be an ally? She had seen a glimpse of vulnerability in him, a flicker of compassion, a hint of the pain he had suffered in the past. He had loved, he had lost, he had carried the burden of guilt and grief for years. He was not simply a ruthless enforcer, a heartless hound of the king. He was a man with his own complexities, his own vulnerabilities. She stole a glance at him, observing him surreptitiously. He was watching the crowd, his gaze constantly moving, assessing, judging. He seemed to be searching for something or someone, his attention focused on the far end of the hall. Cecily followed his gaze, her eyes scanning the faces, trying to understand what he was looking for. She saw nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that would seem to warrant his intense scrutiny. Suddenly, his gaze stopped, focusing on a group of men gathered near the entrance to the hall. They were dressed in the livery of Lord Valerius, the king's sworn enemy, the man who had allegedly corresponded with her late husband. Cecily's heart skipped a beat. What were Valerius's men doing here, in the king's castle? Were they spies, assassins, sent to carry out some nefarious plot? Nicholas rose from his seat, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of his sword. "Stay here, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Do not move." He strode towards the group of men, his movements swift and purposeful, his body radiating a sense of controlled power. Cecily watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a mixture of fear and admiration. He was risking his life to protect the king, to protect the castle, and perhaps even to protect her. She disobeyed his order, of course. She could not simply sit there, waiting, not knowing what was happening. She rose from her seat, her gaze fixed on Nicholas, her mind racing. She saw him confront the men, his voice sharp and demanding. They seemed to be arguing, their voices rising in anger. She saw one of the men reach for his sword, his movements quick and threatening. Cecily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She feared for Nicholas's life, feared that he would be attacked, killed. She had to do something, anything, to help him. She looked around, searching for a weapon, something she could use to defend herself, to defend him. She saw a heavy silver candlestick on a nearby table, its base thick and sturdy. She grabbed the candlestick, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She moved towards the confrontation, her movements slow and cautious, trying to avoid drawing attention to herself. As she approached, she saw Nicholas disarm one of the men, his movements swift and precise, his skill undeniable. He was a trained warrior, a master of combat, and he was more than a match for these men. But there were too many of them. They surrounded him, their swords drawn, their faces contorted with hatred. She knew he could not fight them all off, that he was outnumbered, outmatched. She raised the candlestick, her arm trembling, her mind racing. She had never used a weapon before, had never intended to harm anyone. But she would do whatever it took to protect him, to protect the man who had shown her a flicker of kindness, a hint of humanity. She would fight for him, because in his strength, in his mission, she suddenly perceived an unexpected hope for herself. It felt a sudden, unfamiliar alliance between two hunted creatures, he, the falcon, and she, the dove. Just then, a squadron of the King's Guard burst through the entrance, led by Captain Alaric, a different Alaric, the commander. They'd clearly been alerted, and quickly surrounded Valerius' men, swords drawn. The tension, which had been stretched tight as a bowstring, eased. The men lowered their weapons, realizing the futility of their position. Nicholas, breathing heavily but unharmed, turned and met Cecily's gaze across the now quietening hall. His eyes held a question, and perhaps a flicker of something else: gratitude. The falcon had been saved, not by another predator, but unexpectedly, by the dove. Chapter 9. Beneath a moonlit sky. The immediate crisis averted, the great hall slowly returned to its usual, albeit slightly subdued, revelry. Valerius's men were escorted away, their faces grim, their fate uncertain. Nicholas, after a brief but intense conversation with Captain Alaric, returned to Cecily, his expression a mixture of relief and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Are you all right, Lady Cecily?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle, devoid of its usual harshness. He was looking at the candlestick, still clutched tightly in her hand. Cecily lowered the candlestick, her arm trembling, her heart still pounding. She hadn't realized she was still holding it, a testament to the adrenaline that had surged through her veins. "Yes," she replied, her voice a little shaky. I was worried about you. It was the truth, a truth she hadn't expected to admit, even to herself. She had been worried about him, about his safety, about the possibility of him being harmed. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, this concern for a man who was essentially her jailer. He nodded, his gaze softening slightly. You intervened, he said, his voice almost a whisper. You were prepared to defend me. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of her actions, of her unexpected bravery. Cecily blushed, embarrassed by his scrutiny, by the intensity of his gaze. I couldn't just stand there and watch, she said, her voice barely audible. They were going to attack you. He reached out, his hand gently taking the candlestick from her grasp. His fingers brushed against hers, sending a shiver through her, a strange, unexpected warmth. Thank you, Lady Cecily, he said, his voice low and sincere.
You surprised me.
It was a compliment, of sorts, an acknowledgement of her courage, of her willingness to risk her own safety for his. It was also a recognition of the changing dynamic between them, the shift from captor and prisoner to something else, something more complex, more nuanced. He suggested they leave the Great Hall, the atmosphere still charged with the residue of the near confrontation. Cecily readily agreed, feeling the need for fresh air, for a moment of peace, away from the prying eyes and whispered judgments of the court. They walked in silence through the corridors, the only sound their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Nicholas led her to a small, secluded balcony overlooking the castle gardens. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the landscape, illuminating the manicured lawns, the neatly trimmed hedges, the sparkling fountain in the center. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome contrast to the stuffy atmosphere of the Great Hall. Cecily took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh, clean air, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. Nicholas leaned against the stone balustrade, his gaze fixed on the moonlit gardens. He seemed lost in thought, his expression pensive, his shoulders slumped, as if burdened by a weight she could not see. It is beautiful, Cecily said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the gardens. Yes, he replied, his voice equally soft. It reminds me of another place, another time. She knew he was thinking of Alara, of the woman he had loved and lost, of the tragedy that had shaped his life. She felt a pang of sympathy for him, a sense of shared sorrow, a recognition of the pain they both carried within. Tell me about her, Cecily said, her voice hesitant, unsure if she was crossing a boundary, intruding on his private grief. He turned to her, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes, usually so cold and guarded, held a flicker of vulnerability, of pain. He hesitated for a moment, as if struggling with the decision to reveal the truth. Then, with a sigh, he began to speak. He told her about Alara, about her beauty, her kindness, her unwavering spirit. He told her about their love, about their dreams, about the plans they had made for the future. He told her about the accusations, about the trial, about the execution, about the crushing weight of his grief and his guilt. As he spoke, Cecily listened, her heart aching for him, her own tears mingling with his unspoken sorrow. She understood, more than he knew, the pain of losing a loved one, the agony of being powerless to save them, the burden of carrying their memory, their legacy. When he finished speaking, silence fell between them, a comfortable silence, a shared understanding that transcended words. They stood there, beneath the moonlit sky, two wounded souls finding solace in each other's presence, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of loss and grief. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. And you, Lady Cecily, he asked, his voice gentle. Tell me about your husband. Tell me the truth. It was a challenge, a request, and an offer of trust, all rolled into one. The moon hung heavy in the sky, illuminating the silent question between them. Beneath its light, a new, precarious chapter began. Chapter 10. The Price of Loyalty. The question hung in the cool night air, a stark contrast to the soft moonlight that bathed them. Tell me the truth. Nicholas's voice was gentle, but the words themselves were a demand, a stripping away of the carefully constructed facade Cecily had maintained for so long. She looked out at the gardens, the neatly ordered world a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. The scent of night-blooming jasmine drifted up from below, a sweet, almost cloying fragrance that seemed to mock the bitterness of her memories. "The truth," she repeated, her voice a whisper, almost to herself. "It is a heavy burden to carry, Sir Nicholas." He nodded, his gaze unwavering, his expression a mixture of patience and understanding. He had shared his truth, his pain, and now he was asking her to do the same. It was a fair exchange, a testament to the fragile trust that was beginning to grow between them. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the ordeal. She had kept her secrets locked away for so long, guarded them with a fierce protectiveness. But now, standing here beneath the moonlit sky, with this man who had shown her a glimpse of his own vulnerability, she felt a need to unburden herself, to share the weight of her past. "My marriage to Lord Alaric," she began, her voice halting, her gaze fixed on a distant point in the gardens, was a lie. From the very beginning, she told him about the arranged marriage, about her father's ambition, about her own naive hopes for a loving relationship. She told him about Alaric's coldness, his indifference, his frequent absences. She told him about his other women, about the humiliation she had endured, the silent suffering she had borne. But that was not the worst of it, she continued, her voice trembling, her eyes filling with tears. The worst was his treachery. She told him about the discovery of the letters, about her confrontation with Alaric, about his refusal to abandon his plans, about his death in battle, a convenient escape from the consequences of his actions. She told him about her decision to keep his secret, to protect his reputation, to save her family from ruin. I lied, she confessed, her voice choked with emotion. "I lied to everyone. To the king, to my family, to the world. I pretended he was a hero, a loyal servant of the crown, when in truth he was a traitor." The words were out, the secret revealed, the burden finally lifted. She felt a sense of relief, a release from the years of silence, of deception, of guilt. But she also felt a sense of fear, a fear of his judgment, of his condemnation. Nicholas listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on her face. He did not interrupt, he did not judge, he simply listened, allowing her to unburden herself, to share the weight of her past. When she finished speaking, he reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. His touch was warm, reassuring, a gesture of comfort, of understanding.
"Why?"
he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Why did you protect him? Why did you carry this burden for so long?" It was a fair question, a question she had asked herself countless times. Why had she done it? Why had she sacrificed her own happiness, her own peace of mind, to protect a man who had betrayed her, betrayed his king, betrayed his country? "Loyalty," she replied, her voice barely audible. I believed it was my duty. To my family, to my name, to the memory of the man I thought he was." It was a complex answer, a mixture of duty, of honor, of a misplaced sense of obligation. She had been raised to believe in loyalty, in the importance of family, in the sanctity of marriage, even a marriage built on lies. "But I was wrong," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I see that now. Loyalty should not come at the price of truth. It should not require us to betray ourselves." It was a realization, a moment of clarity, a turning point in her journey of self-discovery. She had been living a lie, trapped by her own sense of duty, by her own fear of the consequences of the truth. But now, she was ready to break free, to embrace the truth, to face whatever consequences may come. Nicholas removed his hand. The air where it had rested on her arm felt suddenly cold. "The king believes you were part of his plot," he stated, his voice now holding less warmth, more of his usual, official tone. Cecily met his eyes. "But you heard my story. Do you believe I was?" He paused, considering, then shook his head slowly. "No. No, I believe your loyalty was misplaced, but not malicious." However, proving that to the king will require more than your confession to me. He looked at her, his expression serious. He started to explain the ramifications, the political web they were caught within, and the price of loyalty and truth in this dangerous game. She knew, suddenly, what she needed to do, and that it was a gamble more dangerous than any she had taken before. Chapter 11. Scars of the Past. The following days were a blur of whispered conversations, clandestine meetings, and mounting tension. Cecily, guided by Nicholas, embarked on a perilous quest to uncover the truth about her late husband's treachery and to find evidence that would clear her name and, perhaps, expose the real conspirators within the king's court. Nicholas, despite his official role as her protector, had become her unlikely ally, his initial suspicion giving way to a grudging respect and, perhaps, something more. He used his knowledge of the castle, his access to information, and his network of contacts to help her navigate the treacherous currents of courtly politics. He revealed more of himself, too, in fragments and guarded admissions. Cecily learned that his dedication to the king stemmed not just from duty, but from a deep-seated loyalty forged in his youth. King Alaric had taken Nicholas in as a squire after his father, a minor lord, had been killed in battle. The king had become a father figure, a mentor, and Nicholas had sworn to serve him with unwavering devotion. The scars of his past, the loss of Alara, had hardened him, made him wary of emotional attachments. But Cecily saw glimpses of the man beneath the armor, the man who yearned for justice, for truth, for a connection that transcended the rigid confines of his duty. One evening, they found themselves in the castle library, a vast chamber filled with ancient tomes and dusty scrolls. Nicholas had discovered a hidden passage, a secret room behind a bookshelf, where he believed some of Lord Alaric of Hawthorne's private papers might be hidden. The room was small and dark, lit only by a single flickering candle. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a testament to the years it had remained undisturbed. Cobwebs hung like macabre tapestries, and the silence was broken only by the rustling of parchment as Nicholas carefully examined the documents. Cecily watched him, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They were searching for evidence, for proof, but they were also stirring up the ghosts of the past, reopening old wounds, risking exposure and retribution. Nicholas found a small, locked wooden box, its surface inlaid with intricate carvings. It was similar to the one in his quarters, Cecily realized, a sudden pang of recognition striking her. He tried to open it, but the lock was stubborn, resisting his efforts. "Let me try," Cecily said, her voice hesitant. She remembered the small dagger she kept hidden beneath her gown, the one she had carried for protection, for self-defense. She retrieved the dagger, its blade thin and sharp, its hilt cool against her palm. She carefully inserted the blade into the lock, her movements precise and delicate, her fingers guided by a memory she had not realized she possessed. She had seen her late husband open similar boxes, using a similar technique. It was a skill he had taught her, a rare moment of intimacy in their otherwise cold and distant relationship. With a soft click, the lock yielded, the box springing open. Cecily felt a surge of triumph, a momentary victory in this dangerous game. Inside the box, they found a collection of letters, bound together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was familiar, the script of Lord Alaric of Hawthorne. But these letters were not addressed to Lord Valerius. They were addressed to someone else, someone within the king's court, someone far more powerful, far more influential. Cecily's breath caught in her throat as she read the name, Lord Grayson, the king's chief advisor.
Edmund's patron.
The man who had been sitting next to her brother in the great hall, the man who had always seemed so trustworthy. Nicholas's face was grim, his eyes narrowed with anger. "Grayson," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "I should have known." The letters detailed a plot, a conspiracy to overthrow King Alaric, to place a puppet king on the throne, a king who would be controlled by Grayson and his allies. Lord Alaric of Hawthorne had been a pawn in their game, a disposable tool used to further their ambitions. Cecily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been used, manipulated, her loyalty exploited by a man she had trusted, a man she had believed to be a friend of her family. "Edmund," she whispered, her voice trembling. He is in danger." She realized, with a chilling certainty, that her brother was unknowingly involved in this conspiracy, that he was being used by Grayson, just as she had been used by her late husband. Nicholas nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "We need to warn him," he said, his voice urgent. "But we need to be careful. Grayson is powerful, influential. He has eyes and ears everywhere." They had found the truth, but the truth had only deepened the danger, widened the web of conspiracy. They had uncovered a serpent in the heart of the kingdom, and they knew that their next move could determine not only their own fate, but the fate of Eldoria itself. The scars of the past had revealed a present threat, and now they were both marked for destruction. Chapter 12. A Shattered Vow. The urgency of their discovery propelled them into action. Nicholas, with his knowledge of the castle's hidden passages and secret corridors, guided Cecily through the labyrinthine depths of the fortress, avoiding the main thoroughfares, the prying eyes of the court. They needed to reach Edmund, to warn him of Grayson's treachery, before it was too late. Cecily's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and determination. She had to save her brother, protect him from the consequences of his unwitting involvement in Grayson's plot. She also had to clear her own name, to prove her innocence, to finally break free from the shackles of her past. As they moved through the shadows, Nicholas spoke in hushed tones, outlining a plan. He would seek an audience with the king, present the evidence they had found, expose Grayson's treachery. Cecily would find Edmund, warn him, and bring him to a safe place, where they could await the king's judgment. It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. They were relying on the king's sense of justice, his willingness to believe them, despite the powerful influence of Lord Grayson. They were also risking their own lives, their own freedom, by challenging a man who held the reins of power, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his ambitions. They reached Edmund's chambers, a suite of rooms located in a quieter section of the castle. Nicholas instructed Cecily to wait outside, while he checked to see if Edmund was alone, if it was safe to enter. Cecily waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her nerves stretched taut. She paced the corridor, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her mind racing through the possible scenarios, the potential dangers. After what seemed like an eternity, Nicholas returned, his face grim, his expression troubled. "He is not alone," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Grayson is with him." Cecily's heart sank. This was worse than she had feared. She could not confront Edmund in Grayson's presence, could not risk exposing their discovery, their plan. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Nicholas hesitated for a moment, his mind working furiously. "We wait," he said, his voice decisive. "We wait until Grayson leaves. Then you will go in and speak to your brother. But you must be careful. Do not reveal everything. Just warn him. Tell him to be cautious, to trust no one." It was a risky strategy, a delicate balance between warning Edmund and protecting their own position. But they had no other choice. They had to act quickly, before Grayson could make his next move, before it was too late. They waited in the shadows, hidden from view, their eyes fixed on the door to Edmund's chambers. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow to their nerves. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the door opened, and Lord Grayson emerged. He was alone, his expression unreadable, his movements purposeful. He walked away, disappearing down the corridor, his footsteps fading into silence. Nicholas turned to Cecily, his gaze intense. "Now," he said, his voice urgent.
"Go.
But be careful. I will be watching." Cecily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the encounter. She approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. She entered the room, closing the door behind her. Edmund was standing by the window, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the moonlit gardens. He seemed lost in thought, his shoulders slumped, as if burdened by a weight she could not see. "Edmund," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. He turned, startled by her presence. His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. "Cecily," he said, his voice guarded. "What are you doing here? How did you get past the guards?" "I need to talk to you," she replied, her voice trembling. It's urgent." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of concern and apprehension. He knew something was wrong, that she was not here for a casual visit. "We don't have much time," Cecily said, stepping toward him. "Edmund, you're in danger." Lord Grayson Edmund cut her off, holding up a hand. "Cecily, I know about your situation. About the accusations. Grayson has been helping me, advising me on how to best approach the king on your behalf." Cecily felt a chill run down her spine. "Edmund, you don't understand. Grayson is not your friend. He's the one who orchestrated all of this. He used my husband, and now he's using you." Edmund shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion and disbelief. That's impossible. Grayson has been nothing but loyal to the king." To me, his voice trailed off, doubt creeping in. Cecily took another step closer, her voice pleading. "I have proof, Edmund. Letters. Between Grayson and my late husband. They were planning to overthrow the king." She saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the seed of doubt she had planted taking root. But before he could respond, before she could fully convince him, the door burst open. It was not Nicholas. Lord Grayson stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. Behind him stood two of the king's guards, their swords drawn. "Treason," Grayson said, his voice like ice. He was pointing at Cecily. "She is the traitor, not I. Seize her." The guards moved to obey, their eyes fixed on Cecily. Edmund stood frozen, caught between his loyalty to his sister and his long-held trust in Grayson, his world shattered by the sudden, violent intrusion of the truth. A vow, not of marriage, but of brotherhood and political alliance, lay broken at his feet. Chapter 13. The Lion's Den. Cecily found herself dragged before King Alaric, not in the formal solar, but in the king's private war room, a chamber adorned with maps, weapons, and the stark reality of power. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the heavy breathing of those present. Lord Grayson stood beside the king, his face a mask of righteous indignation, his voice dripping with venom as he recounted his fabricated tale of Cecily's treachery, of her attempt to corrupt Edmund, to turn him against the crown. He presented a twisted version of events, painting Cecily as the mastermind, Edmund as the innocent victim, and himself as the loyal servant who had uncovered the plot. Edmund stood beside Cecily, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. He had been silenced, intimidated by Grayson's power, his accusations. He had not defended his sister, had not spoken a word in her support. Nicholas was also present, standing a few paces behind Cecily, his expression grim, his gaze fixed on the king. He had been summoned, ostensibly as a witness, but in reality, he was as much on trial as Cecily. His association with her, his assistance in her investigation, had cast a shadow of suspicion over him. King Alaric listened to Grayson's accusations, his face impassive, his eyes narrowed with a cold, calculating intensity. He was a shrewd man, not easily swayed by emotion, by rhetoric. He weighed the evidence, assessed the players, considered the implications. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice finally breaking the silence, "you have heard the accusations against you. What say you in your defense?" Cecily met his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "The accusations are false, Your Majesty," she said. "Lord Grayson is lying. He is the traitor, not I." She recounted her story, her discovery of the letters, her investigation with Nicholas, her attempt to warn Edmund. She spoke with passion, with conviction, her voice ringing with the truth. But Grayson was quick to counter her claims, twisting her words, casting doubt on her motives, portraying her as a desperate woman trying to save herself by blaming others. He presented his own fabricated evidence, forged documents, paid witnesses, all designed to support his narrative. It was a battle of words, a clash of wills, a desperate struggle for survival. Cecily fought with all her strength, all her wit, all her courage. But she was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, her voice drowned out by the powerful influence of Lord Grayson. Nicholas stepped forward, his voice calm and resolute. "Your Majesty," he said, "I can corroborate Lady Cecily's story. I have seen the letters. I have investigated the matter. Lord Grayson is the one who is guilty of treason. It was a brave act, a testament to his loyalty, not to the king, but to the truth. He was risking his own position, his own life, by challenging Grayson, by defending Cecily. But Grayson was prepared for his intervention." He turned on Nicholas, his voice filled with scorn. "Sir Nicholas," he said, "has been seduced by this woman. He has been blinded by her beauty, her wiles. He is no longer a loyal servant of the crown. He is her accomplice." The king's gaze shifted to Nicholas, his eyes questioning, assessing. He trusted Nicholas, had relied on his loyalty for years. But he also trusted Grayson, had relied on his counsel, his advice. He was caught between two trusted advisors, two conflicting narratives, two paths that diverged into the darkness of deception and betrayal. "Nicholas," the king said finally, his voice grave. "Do you have any proof to support these wild accusations?" Nicholas produced the box, the letters. He explained how they'd been found, how they clearly showed the communication between Lord Alaric of Hawthorne and Lord Grayson. Grayson scoffed. "Forgeries. Obvious forgeries. She has had weeks to concoct this plan, to create these false documents." The king examined the letters himself, his brow furrowed. He called for his royal scribe, a wizened old man known for his expertise in handwriting and document authentication. The scribe was brought in, trembling, and set to work under the watchful eyes of everyone in the room. The silence stretched agonizingly. Cecily watched the scribe, her fate hanging on his assessment. Nicholas stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, ready to defend her, to defend himself, if necessary. Edmund remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, his spirit seemingly broken. Finally, the scribe looked up, his voice frail but clear. "Your Majesty," he said, "these letters, they are genuine. The handwriting is that of Lord Alaric of Hawthorne, without a doubt. And the seals, they match other documents known to be from his hand." He hesitated, then looked at Grayson. "And the style, the phrasing, it bears similarities to other documents I have seen written by Lord Grayson." A collective gasp filled the room. Grayson's face went white, then flushed with rage. He opened his mouth to protest, but the king raised a hand, silencing him. Alaric looked from the letters to Grayson, his eyes filled with a cold, hard fury. He had been betrayed, deceived by a man he had trusted, a man he had considered a friend. The lion had been challenged in his own den, and his roar would be deafening. Chapter 14. Trials of the Heart. The revelation of Grayson's treachery sent shockwaves through the court. The king, his trust shattered, his authority challenged, acted swiftly and decisively. Grayson was stripped of his titles, his lands, his possessions. He was imprisoned in the deepest dungeon of the castle, awaiting trial for treason, a trial that would undoubtedly end in his execution. Edmund, shaken by the discovery of Grayson's betrayal, finally found his voice. He confessed his unwitting involvement in the plot, his misguided trust in a man he had believed to be a mentor, a friend. He apologized to Cecily, begging her forgiveness for his silence, his lack of support. The king, though angered by Edmund's naivete, acknowledged his honesty, his willingness to admit his mistakes. He spared Edmund's life, but stripped him of his position on the council, banishing him from court, ordering him to return to Ravensshire, to live a life of quiet contemplation, of atonement. Cecily, her name cleared, her innocence proven, was restored to her former position, her reputation untarnished. She was hailed as a heroine, a woman of courage and integrity, a woman who had risked everything to expose a traitor, to save the kingdom. But the victory felt hollow, the triumph tinged with sorrow. She had lost her husband, her home temporarily, her brother to exile, and her illusions. She had seen the dark underbelly of courtly life, the treachery, the deception, the ruthless pursuit of power. Nicholas, his loyalty to the truth vindicated, remained in the king's service, his position as enforcer strengthened, his reputation enhanced. He had proven himself to be a man of unwavering integrity, a man who would risk everything to uphold justice, to protect the innocent. But he, too, had been changed by the events. The scars of his past, the loss of Alara, had been reopened, the pain renewed. He had seen the consequences of false accusations, the devastating impact of betrayal. In the aftermath of the crisis, Cecily and Nicholas found themselves drawn together, their shared experience forging a bond of understanding, of mutual respect, and perhaps something more. They had faced danger together, had supported each other, had trusted each other. They met often, in the quiet corners of the castle, in the moonlit gardens, in the secluded library. They talked, sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their fears. They found solace in each other's presence, a comfort in their shared understanding of loss, of grief, of the burdens of duty. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, the moon casting a silvery glow over the landscape, Nicholas turned to Cecily, his gaze intense, his expression a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty. "Cecily," he said, his voice low and hesitant, I have come to admire you. Greatly. It was a confession, a tentative admission of feelings that had been growing, slowly, subtly, beneath the surface of their interactions. It was also a recognition of the change in their relationship, the shift from captor and prisoner to something far more profound. Cecily's heart skipped a beat. She had sensed his feelings, had felt a similar stirring within herself. But she had been afraid to acknowledge them, afraid to open herself up to the possibility of love, of happiness, after the pain and disappointment of her past. "Nicholas," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, I feel the same. You have shown me kindness. Strength. You have believed in me." It was a truth she could no longer deny, a truth that had blossomed in the midst of danger, of adversity. She had found in him a strength she had not known she possessed, a courage she had not believed she could muster. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was warm, reassuring, a gesture of affection, of tenderness. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, sending a shiver of desire through her, a longing for a connection she had thought lost forever. "I know I am not what you expected," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am a hardened man, scarred by the past." It was true. He was not the charming, romantic nobleman she had once dreamed of. He was a warrior, a knight, a man who had seen too much, felt too much, suffered too much. "And you are not the docile, obedient lady I expected," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "You are fierce, independent, brave." It was a recognition of their shared strength, their shared resilience, their shared capacity for love, for connection, despite the scars of their past. He leaned closer, his gaze locking with hers. His eyes, usually so cold and guarded, held a warmth, a tenderness, that made her breath catch in her throat. "Cecily," he whispered, his voice barely audible, May I kiss you?" It was a question, a request, a plea. He was giving her the choice, the power, the freedom to accept or reject his advances. He was not assuming anything, not demanding anything, but offering himself, his heart, his vulnerability. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, tears not of sorrow, but of joy, of hope, of a newfound happiness she had not dared to dream of. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative touch that sent a wave of electricity through her. It was a kiss of promise, a kiss of hope, a kiss of a new beginning. The trials of the heart had led them to this moment, a moment of shared vulnerability, of undeniable connection. Chapter 15. A glimmer of hope. The kiss lingered, a fragile bridge between two wounded souls, a promise of a future that had seemed impossible only weeks before. The moonlight bathed them in its silvery glow, the scent of night-blooming jasmine rising from the gardens below, a sweet counterpoint to the lingering shadows of their pasts. When they finally drew apart, a new understanding shimmered between them, unspoken but undeniably present. The trials they had endured, the dangers they had faced, had forged a bond that transcended the rigid confines of their roles, their duties, their pasts. In the days and weeks that followed, their relationship deepened, blossoming slowly, tentatively, like a delicate flower pushing its way through hardened earth. They met in secret, stealing moments together amidst the demands of courtly life, finding solace and companionship in each other's presence. Nicholas, though still bound by his duties to the king, found ways to spend time with Cecily, escorting her on walks through the gardens, joining her for quiet meals in her chambers, sharing stolen moments in the library, the chapel, the secluded corners of the castle. He was no longer her jailer, her protector, but her companion, her confidant, her lover. The word, though unspoken, hung in the air between them, a tangible presence, a promise of a future they were only beginning to imagine. Cecily, freed from the shackles of her past, began to rediscover herself, to embrace the woman she'd been forced to suppress for so long. She found a strength she had not known she possessed, a courage that had been forged in the crucible of adversity. She started to assist those who needed it. With Nicholas quietly but firmly supporting, Cecily began using her position to help those within the castle walls. She helped a young kitchen maid avoid a forced marriage. She found the real thief who had stolen from the royal treasury and was nearly successful in having an innocent man wrongly punished. One afternoon, Nicholas found Cecily in the castle courtyard, surrounded by a group of children. She was teaching them how to read, using a small, worn book of fairy tales. Her face was animated, her eyes sparkling with joy, her laughter echoing through the air. He watched her from a distance, his heart filled with a warmth he had not felt in years. He had seen her strength, her courage, her resilience, but now he saw her tenderness, her compassion, her innate goodness. As he approached, the children scattered, recognizing the king's enforcer, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. Cecily looked up, her smile radiant, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that melted the icy shell around his heart. "Nicholas," she said, her voice filled with a lightness he had rarely heard before. "Look what I found. These children, they are so eager to learn." He nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "You are good with them," he said, his voice a little rough. It was an understatement. She was more than good with them. She was a natural teacher, a nurturer, a woman who radiated warmth and kindness. She blushed, her cheeks tinged with a rosy hue. I enjoy it," she replied. It makes me feel useful." It was more than that, he knew. It was a way for her to connect with others, to share her knowledge, her experience, her love. It was a way for her to heal, to find purpose, to build a new life for herself. He reached out, his hand gently taking hers. His fingers intertwined with hers, a silent affirmation of their connection, their bond. "You are more than useful, Cecily," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You are extraordinary." It was a truth he had come to realize, slowly, gradually, over the weeks and months they had spent together. She was not just a beautiful woman, a noble lady, a survivor of betrayal and intrigue. She was a woman of substance, of character, of unwavering spirit. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "And you, Nicholas," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you are not the man I thought you were. You are kind, compassionate, honorable." It was a recognition of his true nature, the man beneath the armor, the man who had been hidden beneath the scars of his past. It was an acceptance of his flaws, his vulnerabilities, his humanity. He squeezed her hand, his gaze locking with hers. We have both been through much," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But perhaps we can find a way to heal. Together." It was a hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness, a promise of a future where they could finally be free from the shadows of their pasts, where they could embrace love, happiness, and a life together. The glimmer was fragile, but it was there, a beacon in the uncertain landscape of their lives. Chapter 16. The Unveiling of Secrets. Despite the blossoming affection between Cecily and Nicholas, the remnants of courtly intrigue and the weight of their pasts continued to cast long shadows. Nicholas, still bound by his oath to King Alaric, felt a growing conflict between his duty and his burgeoning love for Cecily. He knew that their relationship, if discovered, could be misconstrued, could be used against them, could even be deemed a breach of his loyalty to the king. Cecily, too, felt the pressure. While she was exonerated of the charges of treason, whispers and sidelong glances still followed her in the corridors of the castle. Some still doubted her, still saw her as the widow of a traitor, regardless of the evidence that had cleared her name. She yearned for a life free from suspicion, free from the constraints of court, free to be with Nicholas, without fear of judgment or reprisal. One evening, Nicholas sought out Cecily in the library, a place that had become their sanctuary, a refuge from the prying eyes of the court. He found her poring over an ancient text, her brow furrowed in concentration, a single candle illuminating her face. "Cecily," he said, his voice low and serious, "we need to talk." She looked up, her eyes meeting his, a flicker of apprehension in their depths. She knew, instinctively, that this was not a casual conversation, that something was troubling him. "What is it, Nicholas?" she asked, her voice soft, concerned. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers. He was struggling with his words, with the conflict that was tearing him apart. "The king," he began, his voice halting, he has noticed our closeness." Cecily's heart skipped a beat. She had feared this, had known that their secret meetings could not remain hidden forever. The king's eyes were everywhere, his spies ever watchful. What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He questioned me," Nicholas replied, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. "He asked about my loyalty, about my feelings for you." It was a dangerous situation, a delicate balance between truth and deception. Nicholas could not deny his feelings for Cecily, but he also could not betray his oath to the king. "Well, what did you tell him?" Cecily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I told him the truth," Nicholas replied, his gaze unwavering. "That I admire you, that I respect you, that I care for you." It was a carefully worded response, a truth that did not reveal the full extent of his feelings, a truth that did not explicitly violate his oath. But the king was not a fool. He had seen the way Nicholas looked at Cecily, the way they interacted, the way they sought each other's company. He had sensed the connection between them, the bond that had grown stronger with each passing day. He has made a decision," Nicholas continued, his voice filled with a sense of foreboding. "A decision that affects us both." Cecily's heart pounded in her chest. She braced herself for the blow, for the inevitable decree that would separate them, that would shatter their fragile hope for a future together. He wants us to marry," Nicholas said, his voice barely audible. Cecily stared at him, stunned, speechless. Marriage? It was the last thing she had expected. She had anticipated exile, imprisonment, even death, but not marriage. "Marry?" she repeated, her voice a disbelieving whisper. Nicholas nodded, his gaze searching hers. He believes it is the best solution. A way to solidify your position at court, to silence the whispers, to bind our loyalty to him. It was a political maneuver, a calculated decision designed to strengthen the king's position, to control the narrative, to ensure the loyalty of his most trusted knight, and a woman who had proven herself to be both intelligent and influential. But it was also an opportunity, a chance for Cecily and Nicholas to be together, openly, without fear, without secrecy. A chance for them to build a life together, a life based on love, on respect, on a shared understanding of the burdens of duty and the price of loyalty. He is giving us a choice," Nicholas continued, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "He will not force us, but he believes it is the best course of action." It was a test, a trial of their loyalty, of their love. The king was offering them a path, a way forward, but it was a path fraught with challenges, with uncertainties. It was a path that would require them to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life, to face the judgment of others, to overcome the scars of their pasts. But as Nicholas looked into her eyes, he had a feeling that they were not only willing to follow it, but were also ready to. The king's intentions, however veiled, had finally unveiled the most deeply kept secret of all, their love for each other. Chapter 17. Flight from the castle. The king's proposal, though seemingly a blessing, felt like another form of imprisonment to Cecily. Marriage to Nicholas, a man she loved, should have been a joyous occasion, a celebration of their newfound connection. But the circumstances, the political machinations, the king's controlling hand, tainted the prospect, turning it into another gilded cage. She paced her chambers, her mind racing, her heart torn between her love for Nicholas and her yearning for freedom, for a life unburdened by the constraints of court, by the weight of expectations. She had endured one arranged marriage, a loveless union dictated by duty and ambition. She could not bear the thought of another, even one with a man she loved, if it meant sacrificing her autonomy, her newfound sense of self. Nicholas, sensing her turmoil, sought her out. He found her standing on the balcony, gazing out at the moonlit landscape, her face etched with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Cecily," he said, his voice gentle, concerned. "What troubles you?" She turned to him, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "I cannot do this, Nicholas," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. "I cannot marry you. Not like this. Not under these circumstances." Nicholas was taken aback, his expression a mixture of surprise and hurt. He had expected her to be happy, to embrace the king's proposal, to see it as an opportunity for them to be together. "But I love you, Cecily," he said, his voice pleading.
"And you love me."
"Is that not enough?" "It is not enough, Nicholas," she replied, her voice softening, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek. "Love should be free, unburdened by duty, by obligation, by the dictates of others. I cannot be your wife if it means sacrificing my own freedom, my own sense of self." She explained her fears, her anxieties, her yearning for a life beyond the castle walls, a life where they could be together, not as pawns in a political game, but as two individuals, bound by love, by choice, not by decree. Nicholas listened, his heart aching at her words, but also understanding her perspective, her need for autonomy, for self-determination. He, too, had felt the constraints of duty, the weight of obligation, the suffocating pressure of the king's expectations. What do you propose?" he asked, his voice hesitant, his gaze searching hers. "We leave," she said, her voice firm, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "We leave the castle. We leave the court. We find a place where we can be together, free from all of this." It was a radical idea, a dangerous proposition. To leave the castle without the king's permission would be considered an act of defiance, of rebellion, even of treason. It would mean abandoning their positions, their titles, their security. It would mean risking everything. But it was also a chance for freedom, a chance for them to build a life together, on their own terms, a life based on love, on choice, on a shared desire for a future unburdened by the constraints of their pasts. Nicholas hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks, the consequences. He was a knight, sworn to serve the king, bound by duty, by loyalty. But he was also a man, in love with a woman who yearned for freedom, for a life beyond the castle walls. He looked at Cecily, his gaze locking with hers. He saw the fire in her eyes, the determination in her stance, the unwavering resolve in her heart. He knew that she would not be swayed, that she would not compromise her principles, that she would not settle for a life of gilded captivity. "All right," he said. His voice was thick with emotion. "All right, we leave." He made his decision, casting aside his duty, his loyalty to the king, in favor of his love for Cecily, his desire for a life together, a life of freedom, of choice. He knew that they were embarking on a perilous journey, a flight from the castle, a flight from the only life he had ever known. But as he looked into Cecily's eyes, He was certain that he was flying towards something, not just away. He was flying towards her and a future with her, no matter the cost. Chapter 18. Sanctuary in the Wilds. Their escape was a carefully orchestrated dance of shadows and whispers. Nicholas, with his intimate knowledge of the castle's hidden passages and secret exits, guided Cecily through the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding the guards, the servants, the ever-present eyes of the court. They moved under the cover of darkness, the moon their only companion, the stars their silent witnesses. They carried only the bare essentials, a few changes of clothes, some food and water, a small pouch of gold, and the weapons Nicholas had always kept close at hand. They slipped out of the castle through a long-forgotten postern gate, a hidden exit used centuries ago by smugglers and spies. The gate opened onto a dense forest, a wild and untamed landscape that offered both refuge and danger. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the castle, with its towering walls and imposing presence, receded into the distance, becoming a distant memory, a symbol of the life they had left behind. They traveled for days, following ancient trails, navigating by the stars, avoiding settlements, seeking the solitude and anonymity of the wilderness. They slept under the open sky, huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed close, their hearts beating in unison. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They spoke of the future, of the life they would build together, a life free from the constraints of court, from the weight of expectations, from the shadows of their pasts. Nicholas, though a skilled warrior, a man accustomed to the comforts of castle life, adapted quickly to the harsh realities of the wilderness. He hunted for food, built fires, protected Cecily from the dangers of the forest, his strength and his resourcefulness a constant source of reassurance. Cecily, though initially apprehensive, found a newfound strength within herself, a resilience she had not known she possessed. She learned to forage for food, to identify edible plants, to navigate by the stars, to adapt to the rhythms of nature. Their love deepened, strengthened by their shared adversity, by their reliance on each other, by their unwavering commitment to their newfound freedom. They were no longer a knight and a lady, bound by duty and obligation, but two individuals, forging a new path, building a new life together, in the heart of the wilderness. After weeks of travel, they stumbled upon a secluded valley, a hidden oasis nestled amidst the rolling hills and dense forests. A clear stream flowed through the valley, its waters sparkling in the sunlight, its banks lined with lush vegetation. A small, abandoned cottage stood near the stream, its walls weathered but sturdy, its roof intact, offering shelter and a semblance of home. This is it," Cecily said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and relief. "This is where we will stay." It was a sanctuary, a place of peace and tranquility, a refuge from the world they had left behind. It was a place where they could rebuild their lives, where they could be together, free from the constraints of court, from the judgment of others, from the shadows of their pasts. Nicholas nodded, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a love that transcended words. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent affirmation of their commitment, their bond. They set about making the cottage habitable, cleaning, repairing, restoring it to a semblance of its former glory. They gathered wood, built a fire, cooked their meals, shared their stories, their laughter echoing through the valley, a testament to their newfound happiness, their freedom. They explored the surrounding wilderness, discovering hidden waterfalls, ancient ruins, breathtaking vistas. They lived off the land, hunting, fishing, foraging, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of nature, their spirits renewed by the beauty and the solitude of their surroundings. They were no longer Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's enforcer, and Lady Cecily of Ravensshire, the widow of a traitor. They were simply Nicholas and Cecily, two souls bound by love, by choice, by a shared desire for a life of freedom, of peace, of happiness, in their sanctuary in the wilds. Chapter 19. The Battle for Ravensshire. News, even in their secluded valley, had a way of finding them. A traveling merchant, recognizing Nicholas despite his attempts at disguise, brought word from the outside world. King Alaric was dead. The circumstances were shrouded in mystery. Some whispered of poison, others of a sudden illness. But one thing was clear: Eldoria was in turmoil. Lord Grayson, despite his imprisonment, had loyalists who had attempted to seize power. The attempt had been quelled, but the kingdom was fractured, vulnerable. And then came the most alarming news of all. Ravensshire, Cecily's ancestral home, was under siege. A neighboring lord, sensing weakness, had launched an attack, seeking to claim the lands and title for himself. Edmund, still in exile but fiercely loyal to his family and home, was leading the defense, but he was outnumbered, outmatched. Cecily's heart clenched with fear. Ravensshire, the place she had always considered her sanctuary, was in danger. Her brother, the one she had sought to protect, was fighting for his life. She could not stand idly by while her home was threatened, while her family was in peril. "We have to go back," she said to Nicholas, her voice firm, her eyes blazing with determination. "We have to help Edmund. We have to save Ravensshire." Nicholas knew that look. He'd seen in countless times in battle. But this battle was different. It was personal. He hesitated, his mind grappling with the implications. Returning to Eldoria meant facing the consequences of their flight, risking capture, imprisonment, even death. It meant abandoning their newfound freedom, their sanctuary in the wilds. But he saw in her eyes that the pull of the past, the responsibility, was not a chain, but something that she was ready to take up on her own terms. He nodded, his gaze meeting hers, his heart filled with a mixture of apprehension and admiration. "We go back," he said, his voice resolute. "We fight for Ravensshire. Together." Their journey back was swift and perilous. They traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads, relying on Nicholas's knowledge of the terrain and his skills as a warrior to evade detection. As they neared Ravensshire, the signs of war became increasingly apparent. Burned villages, deserted farms, fields littered with the debris of battle. The air was thick with smoke, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of clashing steel, of cries of pain and anguish. They reached Ravensshire under the cover of night, slipping past the besieging army's lines, finding a hidden entrance known only to those who had grown up within its walls. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking. The castle, once a symbol of strength and resilience, was battered and scarred. Walls were breached, towers crumbled, the courtyard littered with the bodies of the fallen. The defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, were fighting with a desperate courage, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of determination and despair. Edmund, his armor dented and bloodied, was leading the defense, his voice hoarse, his movements weary, but his spirit unbroken. He saw Cecily and Nicholas, his eyes widening in surprise, then filling with a glimmer of hope. "Cecily! Nicholas!" he exclaimed, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. You came back. "We could not abandon you, Edmund," Cecily replied, her voice firm, her hand reaching out to grasp his. "We are here to fight. For Ravensshire. For our family." Nicholas, his sword drawn, his body radiating a sense of controlled power, stepped forward. "Tell us what needs to be done," he said, his voice calm and resolute. Edmund, revitalized by their arrival, quickly outlined the situation. The besieging army was larger and better equipped, but their morale was low, their leadership divided. He believed that a decisive blow, a well-coordinated attack, could break their siege, could drive them back. Nicholas, with his experience as a warrior, as a commander, took charge of the defense. He rallied the remaining soldiers, reorganized their lines, devised a strategy, his presence inspiring confidence, his skill instilling hope. Cecily, though not a warrior, played a crucial role. She tended to the wounded, organized supplies, rallied the women and children, her courage and her compassion bolstering the spirits of the defenders. The battle that followed was fierce and brutal. The clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, The roar of the flames filled the night. Nicholas, a whirlwind of motion, fought with a ferocity born of love and loyalty, his sword cutting down enemy after enemy. Edmund, inspired by his sister and Nicholas, fought with renewed vigor, his determination fueled by a desire to protect his home, his family. Cecily, moving among the wounded, her hands stained with blood, her heart aching for the suffering, offered comfort, solace, and a glimmer of hope in the midst of the carnage. As dawn approached, the tide of the battle began to turn. The besieging army, demoralized by Nicholas's strategic brilliance and the defenders' fierce resistance, began to waver. Their lines broke, their attack faltered. Their retreat became a rout. Ravensheim was saved. The siege was lifted. The enemy was defeated. But the victory came at a cost. Many lives were lost. The castle was severely damaged, the scars of war etched deep into the landscape, into the hearts of those who had survived. Standing amidst the wreckage, surrounded by the exhausted but jubilant defenders, Cecily and Nicholas looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a profound sense of accomplishment. They had fought for Ravensheim, for their family, for their future. And they had won. The battle, however, was only one part of the war. Now they had to face the consequences of their return. Chapter 20. A New Dawn. With Ravensheim secured and the immediate threat dispelled, Cecily and Nicholas knew they could no longer avoid the larger implications of their return. Eldoria was without a king, its future uncertain. While their flight had been motivated by a desire for personal freedom, their actions, especially Nicholas's desertion, would be viewed through a political lens. They decided to travel to the capital, not to reclaim their former positions, but to offer their assistance in restoring order and to face whatever judgment awaited them. Edmund, his banishment effectively rescinded by his defense of Ravensheim, accompanied them, his loyalty to his sister and his newfound respect for Nicholas unwavering. The capital was a city in mourning, but also a city on edge. The remnants of Grayson's faction, though scattered, still posed a threat, and various nobles were vying for power, their ambitions threatening to plunge the kingdom into further chaos. Upon their arrival, Cecily and Nicholas were immediately summoned before the remaining members of the royal council, a group of nobles and advisors struggling to maintain some semblance of governance. The atmosphere in the council chamber was tense, the air thick with suspicion and uncertainty. Nicholas, standing tall and proud, explained their actions, their flight from the castle, their return to defend Ravensheim. He spoke of their love for each other, of their desire for a life free from political machinations, but also of their unwavering loyalty to Eldoria. Cecily, her voice clear and strong, echoed his sentiments. She spoke of her past, of the injustices she had suffered, of her desire for a future where truth and justice prevailed. She spoke of her love for Nicholas, of her belief in his integrity, of their shared commitment to serving the kingdom. Edmund, his voice filled with newfound conviction, supported their claims. He spoke of Nicholas's bravery in defending Ravensheim, of Cecily's compassion and leadership, of their unwavering loyalty to their family and their home. The council members listened, their faces impassive, their eyes assessing, judging. They were divided in their opinions. Some saw Cecily and Nicholas as rebels, as deserters, as a threat to the established order. Others saw them as heroes, as saviors, as a potential solution to the kingdom's instability. After a long and arduous debate, the council reached a decision. They recognized Nicholas's service in defending Ravensheim, his unwavering loyalty to the crown, despite his personal choices. They acknowledged Cecily's exoneration from previous charges, her courage, and her leadership. They offered Nicholas a choice: return to his position as the king's enforcer, or retire from service with honor, retaining his titles and lands, but relinquishing his official duties. It was a generous offer, a recognition of his service, and a tacit acceptance of his relationship with Cecily. But Nicholas, his heart no longer bound by duty alone, made a different choice. "I thank you for your offer," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "But I choose neither. I will not return to my former position, nor will I retire to a life of idle comfort. I will serve Eldoria, but not as a knight, not as an enforcer, but as a protector. He explained his vision, to establish a new order, a group of men and women sworn to protect the innocent, to uphold justice, to defend the realm, not from external threats, but from internal corruption, from the abuse of power, from the very forces that had driven them into exile. Cecily, her eyes shining with pride and admiration, stepped forward. "And I will stand by his side," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I will use my knowledge, my experience, my influence, to support this new order, to ensure that justice prevails, that the innocent are protected, that Eldoria becomes a kingdom worthy of its people." The council members, initially surprised by their proposal, were eventually swayed by their conviction, by their vision, by the undeniable strength of their commitment. They agreed to support their endeavor, to provide them with the resources they needed, to grant them the authority to establish their new order. And so, a new dawn broke over Eldoria. A dawn of hope, of justice, of a future where love and loyalty could coexist, where freedom and responsibility could flourish, where the scars of the past could finally begin to heal. Nicholas and Cecily, no longer bound by the constraints of their former lives, embarked on their new journey. Together, their love a beacon of hope, their strength a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They would build their new order, their sanctuary, not in the wilds, but in the heart of the kingdom, their lives a testament to the power of love, of choice, of a future forged in the fires of adversity. A new dawn had risen, and it was brighter for their courage. Epilogue. Years passed. The valley that had once been their refuge became a thriving community, a center of learning and justice, the headquarters of the protectors as Nicholas and Cecily's new order came to be known. Men and women, drawn from all walks of life, came to train, to learn, to dedicate themselves to the ideals of truth, justice, and compassion. Nicholas, no longer the stern-faced enforcer, but a wise and compassionate leader, guided the protectors, his experience and his unwavering integrity shaping their ethos, their mission. He had found his true calling, not in enforcing the king's law, but in upholding the principles of justice, of fairness, of protecting the vulnerable. Cecily, no longer the Lady of Ravensshire, bound by duty and tradition, but a powerful and influential figure in her own right, used her knowledge and her influence to shape the policies of the protectors, to ensure that their actions were guided by wisdom, by compassion, by a deep understanding of the human condition. Their love for each other deepened with each passing year, their bond strengthened by their shared purpose, their mutual respect, their unwavering commitment to the ideals they had embraced. They had built a life together, a life of meaning, of purpose, of love, a life that had defied expectations, that had overcome adversity, that had transformed a kingdom. Ravensshire, rebuilt and revitalized, flourished under Edmund's stewardship. He had learned from his mistakes, had grown into a wise and just ruler, his loyalty to his family and his people unwavering. He often visited Cecily and Nicholas, their bond of kinship strengthened by the trials they had endured, by the victories they had shared. Eldoria, too, prospered. The protectors, under Nicholas and Cecily's leadership, became a force for good, a bulwark against corruption and injustice. The kingdom, once fractured and vulnerable, became strong and united, its people secure in the knowledge that they were protected, that justice would prevail. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Nicholas and Cecily stood hand in hand, watching the protectors train in the courtyard below. They were older now, their hair streaked with silver, their faces lined with the passage of time, but their eyes still shone with the same fire, the same determination, the same love that had brought them together so many years ago. "We did it, Cecily," Nicholas said, his voice soft, his gaze fixed on her. "We built a new life, a better life." Cecily nodded, her eyes filling with tears, tears not of sorrow, but of joy, of gratitude, of a profound sense of accomplishment. "We did it together, Nicholas," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "And we will continue to do it. For as long as we live." They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. They had faced adversity, had overcome challenges, had defied expectations. They had found love, freedom, and purpose in a world that had tried to deny them all three. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together, silhouetted against the fading light, two figures who had transformed a kingdom, who had built a new dawn, who had found their forever in the midst of chaos and strife. Their love story, born in the shadows of a castle, had blossomed in the heart of a valley, a testament to the enduring power of hope, of courage, and of a love that knew no bounds. Their legacy was secure, written not in stone, but in the hearts of those they had helped, and in the future they had built together. The end.